the California National Party, is that a secessionist party?
I mean, our ultimate goal is independence for California, but our general premise is policies that are best for California. That's
well, I'm against the secession movement of California.
This idea of kind of California messianism, that sort of the United States will utterly fall apart without California and our amazing 2 senators. I don't understand how you're going to do it.
By refusing to present a socialist alternative, the DSA is essentially saying all opposition to Newsom has to flow through the far right.
I actually was a socialist 10 years ago. I no longer am.
Why is that?
Socialists believe that there are 3 types of people in the world. Socialists, people who are socialists that aren't aware that they're socialists yet, and the enemy.
If Mr. Loebs had studied as Marx, he would know that we actually divide the world between capitalists and workers. That fundamentally the distinction is between those who work for a living selling their labor power on the market and those who own things for a living. And it's a very sharp distinction.
I am so thrilled to be joined today by 3 left candidates in the Gavin Newsom recall election. Professor Michael Loebs, political science lecturer at San Francisco State University. Welcome.
Thank you.
Socialist Equality candidate David Moore.
Thank you.
And Green Party candidate Dan Kapelovitz, criminal defense and animal rights attorney.
Thank you.
So the first question I want to ask all 3 of you is the question that California voters will have to ask before any recall takes place, which is, do you think Gavin Newsom should be recalled and why? Let's start with you, Dan.
I don't know if I think I'm one of the few candidates that have been saying from day one that I'm going to vote no on the recall. I don't think he should be recalled. I'm not the hugest fan of Gavin Newsom. I particularly don't like some of the things he's doing in terms of this campaign, in terms of telling people not to vote for anybody for question 2. I think that's not a good strategy. But I do think this is, even though a lot of the candidates are left-leaning, I do think that it was, the right wing who put this on the ballot. So they know that's the only way they could possibly get a governor in the governor's mansion. And because they know they only need, maybe this time might only be 10% of the vote, as opposed to 50% they usually need, which in this day and age they're never going to get.
Michael, do you agree?
Well, so the California National Party, of which I'm the chair, hasn't really taken any position on the recall. I mean, I feel like it's something that Californians can look at their own lives and make a determination about what they think. I mean, like Dan, I am not a fan of Gavin Newsom, and I've lived in San Francisco the last 2 decades, so I've kind of seen what his brand of leadership and decision making and style has done. I definitely think people should vote no on the recall if they see this as something that's going to lead to a worse outcome. But I'm also very troubled by the developments in California of the last few decades, where there's this sort of sense of like the Democrats are entitled to power simply by virtue of being Democrats, that they never have to actually run on any sort of qualifications or messaging or any sort of actual political or administrative success. It's more just about, because you're the Democrat, you deserve to win. And I think that's what we've seen in sort of like the strange support for the whole Meet Kevin thing, is he's just sort of the Democrat with the most name brand recognition. So I definitely do not think any of the front runners are going to do a better job than Newsom, and most by and large a more terrifying one. But I also can see why the job Newsom has done, in particular in the Democratic sort of monolithic Democratic one-party state culture in California, is in and of itself problematic. So I can certainly understand the popular frustration against all of that.
And David, does the Socialist Equality Party take a different stance?
We take a subtly different stance. We are in agreement to vote no on the recall election because, as has been mentioned, it has overwhelmingly been organized by far-right forces who are looking to remove even the most remedial public health measures relating to the pandemic, that are looking to really wage a full assault on the working class. But it's very worth pointing out that the only reason this recall petition got millions of signatures is because of Gavin Newsom's complete mishandling of the pandemic, because in following the Democratic Party line nationwide, he's been throwing things reopen. and has ultimately placed the entire burden of the pandemic primarily on the working class while giving enormous exemptions to the ultra-rich. So it's that the recall is happening because people are breaking with the Democratic Party, but we have to unequivocally state no to the right-wing recall, but let's use this as an opportunity to organize a politically conscious opposition to these policies Newsom is putting forward.
Do you see any relationship between the entitlement that you're describing in California, exhibited by the Democratic Party, to the votes of Californians and kind of the vote blue no matter whoism that's been happening on a national stage?
Yeah. I mean, the entire campaign strategy of Newsom here is to hold the state hostage, to say, if it's not me, the state will burn, in a way quite literally. But also very much in terms of the pandemic, essentially saying, if I'm out, then we're going to have what's going on in Florida and Texas. But the fundamental con of it is that despite surface differences, the end point of Newsom's policies and DeSantis in Florida is actually the same, which is mass infections relating to the pandemic and mass bailouts and a mass shift of wealth to the rich, while more and more people face eviction and homelessness and hunger. So, yeah, it is part of that stranglehold you're talking about.
Well, I want to drill down on some of the specific issues that seem to have galvanized the recall effort in particular. You mentioned homelessness. I think somebody evoked the mask mandates. Can someone, and multiple of you can answer this question, but why is it that there is so much, can you give some context for why there has been enough animosity toward Gavin in the state to provoke this kind of effort? And where do your policy solutions differ from his? Let's start with you, Michael.
Well, I think part of the issue is, and I think David was alluding to this, is how much during the pandemic, most of the burden of suffering was placed on primarily working class people, and especially, I think, people in the service industry. Again, here in San Francisco, especially with the reliance on tourism and other parts of the service industry, just this unilateral decision by California, by Gavin Newsom about California to do this lockdown without any sort of real structural support for the economic fallout that would have on millions of Californians, and a kind of almost just general let them eat cake attitude. There have been so many people I've known who work in the service industry, and my feeling is if the state is going to throw you out of work, even temporarily, it is the state's duty to take care of you while it is doing that. A bunch of people just sort of, and the first lockdown was different. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what the consequences were, what the long-term ramifications were. But certainly the second lockdown that began in December with Gavin Newsom just, on a Zoom camera from the basement of this mansion, throwing hundreds of thousands of people out of work at the beginning of December and kind of just saying, good luck, have fun. I think that really caused a lot of people to see Newsom as just remarkably out of touch with the kind of problems and suffering that people had during this pandemic. So, for example, in terms of specific solution, one of the major focal points of my campaign and of the California National Party in general is just get rid of the entire EDD system, which treats you like a criminal for needing help, which doesn't actually get you any help, which is subject to massive fraud and manipulation. And for us, we see that can just be replaced with a straightforward system of negative income tax, monthly universal basic income, and automatic Medi-Cal enrollment for all Californians. And through that sort of triple-pronged approach, you can get help to people when they need it without having to have them go through all the rigmarole in the middle of a massive economic collapse, attempting to prove their justifications for having to need assistance at this point in time. So I think that was more than anything, I think, what really pushed off people who are not part of this Republican recall right-wing strategy, but people who really did feel like this government really just doesn't care about us, and that the pandemic and the lockdown really just became a system whereby a bunch of poor people did dangerous jobs and provided services for better off people who were able to sit in their homes and do their work from computers, and not have to deal with the consequences of riding public transit or being in this circumstance where you have multiple people interacting. They could avoid that sort of thing, while the people kind of at the bottom of the social totem pole had to continue to take these high-risk activities and keep going to work, or if they were lucky, or just sit there and hope they could get EDD assistance. So I think that is really what sparked a lot of people against Newsom at the end of last year and the beginning of this year.
Dan, do you agree with that kind of diagnosis of what sparked all of this? And do you have any different policy prescriptions?
Well, I think to be fair to Newsom, it's almost a no-win situation. COVID, I don't think California did anything like way worse than any other state. I mean, people are mad if he opens things. People are mad if he closes things. Even here, you get different views. I agree. I mean, some things are totally ridiculous, like the curfew. You shouldn't have, like, it made no sense. Closing beaches doesn't seem to make...
For all the non-Californians listening, what is the curfew?
Well, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was actually a curfew. You couldn't leave your house after, I think it was like 6 p.m. or something. And it just made no sense. In fact, it'd be better if people spread out time-wise. Like, grocery stores that used to be open 24 hours were now open like 6 hours a day, and everyone's waiting in line, all shoved in together. And a lot of it's, at the beginning, people didn't really know what to do. And then, so people were upset with Newsom. And then, he went to that restaurant and everyone thought that was very hypocritical. He's telling people not to go out. And that was obviously a major mistake on his part politically.
That's the French Laundry debacle, the picture seen across the world.
No, it's not the worst thing anyone's ever done, obviously. I mean, but the right wing was really able to use that. And just the fact people are unhappy with COVID, that's a lot of people are really upset just in general. And it's easy to blame the governor. But yeah, I agree with Michael. I agree. I mean, we got to help people in these times. We got to help the universal income, healthcare for all. It's a right. Help people with back rent who can't pay rents. Help landlords with mortgage. And they're supposedly doing some of this stuff. We'll see how it plays out. And I think, I don't know. I just feel like one thing we haven't really done. I don't think we have a test that actually works for COVID. There are tests. They seem to have a lot of false negatives, false positives. And I think testing is almost more important than vaccinations, because if you have COVID, you can act accordingly. And if they were rapid, you could actually do it like at an event or at a school. You could actually find out if people are, contagious. And the vaccine, obviously I got vaccinated. I think it does protect you. It doesn't seem to protect others so much. It seems like, we don't even, that's the problem. We got to be honest with the people, not so much a criticism of Newsom, but at the beginning of the pandemic, there was actual lies to people saying don't wear a mask because they were just wanting to save masks. It's like, you got to be honest and let people make their decisions. So if I was governor, I would obviously get all the, the best scientific data and make decisions accordingly. And, I haven't taken a dime for any special interests, unlike Newsom, obviously. I don't think any of us have. So I'd be able to do the right thing no matter what the right thing was.
To what extent do you think that Gavin Newsom's kind of policy prescriptions around COVID have been motivated by the special interests? And anyone can address that. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Well, I don't have any, total specifics, but just like you said, the rich can sort of do what they want. He can do what he wants and go to, and they're a lot better off. Like they can work from home. And I don't know if that's like obviously he's not dictating. That's sort of the facts of what happened. Some jobs you can't do from home. And I don't know if, some people are mad they shut down, so they're losing their jobs. And some people are mad that they're open because then they're exposed to COVID. So in a way you can't win. As specific in this with COVID, it's not really so much special interests dictating it. I don't think the big pharma is like telling them you better sell this vaccine or anything like that. But just in general, he's sort of for the wealthy, for the corporations, and not really for the people, the common person.
David, I want to get you in here. Dan raised this issue of hypocrisy. And I got to say, when I'm listening to coverage of the debates and the conservatives talking about, their qualms with Newsom, there is a real emphasis on the hypocrisy, the picture in the fancy restaurant, the fact that Newsom's children are going to a private school that is open, where, while public schools have been closed, a feeling that what's good for ye is not good for thee, or what good for me is not good for thee. Is your sense that is a kind of a line of reasoning and a frustration that runs through Californians on a bipartisan basis? And what, if any, is your solution to addressing some of those concerns, which, to Dan's point, are somewhat circumstantial, somewhat damned if you do, damned if you don't? There's no good solutions for them.
Well, I do really disagree with the thought that there are no good solutions in this pandemic, and that it was such a situation, because there is a lot of focus on Newsom's personal hypocrisy and the personal dislike one may feel looking at pictures of him throwing away homeless encampment stuff, things along those lines. But the real heart of all of this is politics. And we have to be clear, Newsom has been doing the Democratic Party playbook regarding the pandemic, which has included a lot of lies, which has included a lot of disinterest in the health and well-being of ordinary working class people. And to give one clear example of the heart of that, on August 16th, the same day Los Angeles schools are opening here in California, one of the largest school districts in the country, the Newsom administration issued an executive order warning hospitals that they need to be prepared to receive emergency transfers of COVID patients because they expect a massive increase in hospitalizations. This is after Newsom in June and July was saying vaccines will end the pandemic on their own. And the real heart of the crisis, that's not just a crisis of Newsom in California, but a crisis of the Democrats and Republicans nationally, is that they have never had a policy for ending the pandemic. They have crossed their fingers and said, well, the vaccine will handle it for us and we don't need to really do anything once the vaccine's around. But compared to last year, when California was also in a surge, August 2020, we have the vaccine now, and the numbers are actually worse now in terms of hospitalizations, in terms of infections, precisely because the Democrats and Republicans both refuse to listen to science, refuse to fight to eliminate the pandemic. And so we have two deeply unviable approaches, the herd immunity through natural infection being pushed very openly by DeSantis and some of these southern governors, and the mild mitigation measures pushed in New York, pushed in California by some of these Democratic governors, that still results in millions of people getting infected, which in turn allows the pandemic to evolve further and escape vaccines and infect more people. So very basic public health measures at the beginning of this pandemic could have eliminated transmission in California and across the United States. But a conscious decision was made to not pursue them because they impinged on profits. And to give you one example of the special interests that Newsom serves, Elon Musk, in March 2020, had about $25 billion as his net worth. It's now $180 billion. This is a man who defied public health orders to keep the Tesla plant in Fremont running, leading to a massive outbreak. And Newsom at the time praised him. The local county health department actually covered up the outbreak at the Fremont plant, intentionally hiding these infections from the public. And so there's been, I mean, that's the real hypocrisy. The French Laundry, you know, it's a picture that speaks to people, but it's not the real issue. The issue is these class points.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what public health interventions you would have liked to have seen at the start of the pandemic, and what, if you were to become governor, you would like to implement now at this point? Absolutely.
So even now, with the Delta virus that's so much more infectious than the original variant, a lockdown measure of 2 months should eliminate almost the entirety of transmission. It could have been done. If we'd acted earlier, it could have been a lot shorter. But now here's the key thing, which Newsom did not do in the initial lockdowns. They did not take the time bought by the lockdowns to actually improve healthcare, improve contact tracing. They did not, as has been mentioned, give full compensation to workers or to small business owners to allow them to successfully remain locked down. And so what we need to do is a lockdown to eliminate the main thrust of transmission of the Delta variant, combine that with a very sharp increase of healthcare infrastructure to allow contact tracing, an improvement of data collection. Something that is shameful in California is essentially from the beginning of the pandemic, there has been no statewide tracking of outbreaks in schools, which, considering the majority of unvaccinated in the state are school children, that is absolutely shameful. And so then if you end community transmission through a lockdown, you can then, if you have a robust system of contact tracing and quarantine for travel in place, maintain everything open. I mean, obviously, to be fully effective, this has to be integrated into an international system so that we don't get even new, more infectious variants. But if California, if the workers of California fought for that, it would be an immense service to humanity in taking millions of people out of the path of the pandemic.
Yeah, I wondered if you were thinking, if you're modeling that approach on some of the success stories we've heard from certain parts of the world, namely Australia. And the pushback is, well, it's different for island nations. They have a much greater ability to control their borders, the United States, or even, California specifically, given that it is part of a contiguous nation and, not an island in the Pacific. So, I do take your point, though, and I think it's interesting. I want to talk to you about this at some point, about the kind of international focus. And I want to ask whether, as a member of the Socialist Equality Party, you think that that's a part of your approach that's integrated into your kind of policy perspective more broadly, and if it differs from some of the approaches taken by the other members of this panel, the California Democratic Party or the Green Party's approach at all.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of two main points to your question. What are we modeling this on in the science and, the internationalism aspect. And so to tackle the first, certainly Australia and New Zealand have had some initial successes in a zero COVID policy, although the Australian government is quickly losing their appetite for it in the face of the Delta variant and very close to throwing things open in a disastrous decision. And although those are island states, we also have very sharp examples of China, of South Korea. And if anyone says, for example, that the United States cannot eliminate the pandemic, all we have to look at is China, where it's been eliminated multiple times. And that is a much larger, more dense population with a much more open and porous border system than the United States. Now, I have immense criticisms of the Chinese government, and I believe they absolutely did not do enough to protect Chinese workers in terms of those initial lockdown measures, but they made the conscious decision that they were going to eliminate transmission, and they did it. And the U.S. has far more money, as a far wealthier country than China. The resources are there to actually accomplish it. Now, in terms of the second question on internationalism, I think it's a very important one, and I do think it differs sharply from the Green Party and absolutely from the California National Party. We exist in a completely international economic system. There is no major issue confronting Californians today that can be solved on the basis of California alone, whether that's climate change and the wildfires, whether that's the pandemic, whether that's the economic crisis of 2008. The fundamental aspect that socialists fight for is that workers here in the United States have far more in common with workers in Mexico, China, Sri Lanka than we do with a billionaire in the United States. And so I'm looking to rally workers across the entire globe to end the pandemic, we have to be honest, capitalism has failed to contain the pandemic. The option was there, and the decision was made at high levels in governments across Europe and North America that they would allow this to rip through the population. And some of them very cynically, very darkly, there's actually a think tank piece from Britain that said this, it's actually going to be a long-term boon to the economy because it's mostly killing retired people. So then all of a sudden you get pension funds that are solvent again. All of a sudden you get reduced healthcare costs. And there are some ghouls that really believe that in terms of government think tanks. And that's kind of informing the Johnson government's approach there.
Is that part of what, I mean, I've heard some, people on the left and even Democrats kind of glibly talk about how absurd, how short-sighted the Republican approach to COVID is, given that all of, quote, like their people are dying off first. But I mean, is it overly cynical to think that the kind of cost benefit of that, given the economic incentives, make it not such a silly decision from a craven materialist perspective?
It is a ridiculous decision, even from a craven materialist perspective, because the heart of it is we don't actually know the long-term impact of COVID. Early studies coming out suggest that if a child even has mild symptoms of COVID, it's going to have a neurological impact similar to lead poisoning. We don't know how long that lasts. Hopefully they recover from it. But we have long COVID symptoms that are going over a year in time for some of these people infected. I recently gave a presentation to some teachers on this, but you have a vastly increased incidence of mental health issues, mood, anxiety disorders coming out after infection with COVID. You get all these, and then of course the sheer volume of death, which doesn't just target the elderly and infirm. And, one of the big lies is, it only kills people with underlying conditions, but that's like 60% or more of the population have underlying conditions. Almost everyone has underlying conditions. So what we're seeing increasingly, particularly with this Delta variant and the reopening of schools, is young children are getting infected and hospitalized at unprecedented rates during this pandemic. And it is, I worked as a special education teacher for 5 years. It is horrifying. Yeah.
Well, Michael, I want to bring you in and ask you what you make of this kind of, tacit critique of a lack of an international approach, and what you make of the argument as to what should be done about COVID at this juncture.
I mean, I think there's a multiple. So I should point out, being part of the California National Party doesn't make you a California isolationist. And in fact, the argument of the California National Party is that California independently can be a substantially better international partner than California as part of the United States, as essentially a decaying, once top-tier empire that is having to deal with the reality of the 21st century. So certainly nobody in the California National Party is talking about California isolationism. We're talking about California being able to actually be an international partner that it can't be in things like pandemic response, in things like climate change, in things like global international trade, because we're stuck underneath the policies of the United States, who, since the Second World War, have switched the party of their president pretty much every 4 to 8 years. So I think what would be better in terms of Californians would be having a strictly California policy, which can then interact with the international community. So, for example, you brought up things like climate change, and yeah, absolutely. California can continue to do all the environmental policies it wants, but as long as the rest of the world continues to pump out, greenhouse gases, continues to engage in, large-scale industrial extraction of resources, things that are actually needed for things like batteries for electric cars. I mean, environmental destruction, by and large, isn't going away. It's shifting into another form of environmental destruction. And California, as a significant international player, needs to be a part of that dialogue instead of simply just being this subunit of the policies of the United States. And I think where that actually comes most starkly is what David was talking about and what you were addressing in terms of so-called, island nations being able to protect their borders more. I mean, no matter what the United States did, California was always going to be taking in people, could not legally prevent the movement of people from North Dakota, could not legally prevent the movement of people from Mississippi. We can have all the community lockdowns and prevent community transmission as we want, but as long as Americans can continue crossing into California's borders with whatever sort of, policies that they have inherited from their states, that's going to make it more difficult for California to control our own outbreak. So I guess I would say, sorry, Colin.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. It raises an interesting question for me, because on some level, anybody who's governor is going to be faced with these concerns. And that is not to let Gavin Newsom off the hook. I think it's really useful to speak in specific terms, the way you were doing, David, about the different kinds of policy interventions that could have been done. But another piece of this, what strikes me as what's so interesting about this whole situation in California right now, is that the rhetorical fodder that's being used by Republicans is in a lot of ways been handed to them on a silver platter by Democrats because of some of this hypocrisy, because of the shallowness of the trust science language when you then see all of the flip-flopping on mask usage and such. And I'm curious whether, as people who have some remove from the Democratic Party apparatus, you see your ability to be critical of those moments as a rhetorical boon for you and an ability to connect with conservative voters better than a Democratic Party candidate might be able to do. Because there is, I guess I'm thinking still in national terms and about how Bernie kind of occupied this lane where somebody would say, in that famous debate with Ted Cruz about healthcare, Ted Cruz says, oh, the ACA has all these problems with it. And Bernie's able to say, yeah, totes, let's do Medicare for all. Instead of having to double down and defend the obvious issues with the status quo. And I wonder, about your ability to connect with voters on that basis, and if there's any chance, if there was ever any moment where there could have been a left candidate that galvanized folks to the extent that, let's say, a Larry Elder seems to have done.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main goals of the California National Party is, no disrespect to the other two people on this call, but when it comes to Socialist Equality or the Green Party, you kind of either ideologically agree with them or you don't. You're on a side or you're not. And part of the thing about the California National Party is because it is only about California, it allows us to craft policy and messaging that's geared towards specific California voters. So, for example, when we say automatic Medi-Cal enrollment for all Californians, if I need to go to Berkeley and sell that as healthcare is a human right, and I have to go to Inyo County and sell that as grandma shouldn't die horribly of cancer just because she doesn't have insurance, I still get the same policy at the end, which is automatic Medi-Cal enrollment for all Californians. If the messaging to get that outcome has to be different in different parts of California to appeal to different groups of voters, but we still get the outcome that we want, I think that's what's more beneficial. So that's why I think something like UBI negative income tax is a useful one, because fundamentally what that's going to do is it's going to take money from urban Democratic powered blue coastal California and move that money into rural communities, inland communities that have often been ignored by the majority Democratic government in California because they look at MODOK, they look at Siskiyou, they look at Tehama, and they're like, well, we're never going to win there. Why do we need to care about why do we have any concerns about these people in state of Jefferson? Why do we have any concerns about these people in the Sierra? Because they're never going to vote Democrat anyway. And
go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
But I think one of the interesting things about it is, we've talked to people we have in like Tuolumne and Inyo, and these people say, look, I know the Republicans keep winning here, but some of them are Republicans, but some of them just never would be caught dead voting for a Democrat. If I'm in Inyo County, the Democrats, those people who go to Sacramento, allow Los Angeles County to take all our water, never give us anything back for it, completely ignore the fact that we lack any sort of right now, firefighting infrastructure. There are literally not professional firefighters in Inyo County. You ship out prisoners from San Luis Obispo who know nothing about the geography, who know nothing about, the flora in that area, who don't know where the fire breaks are naturally, and you expect them to somehow do a decent job. So a lot of rural inland California has been ignored, but because rural inland California tends to vote Republican simply because they won't stomach voting for Democrats, who tend to use their centralized power in Sacramento against them, then nothing ever gets done. And that's part of why the goal of the California National Party is to get out of this team red versus team blue sort of outlook and figure out what works best in California. And whatever's going on outside California, vote for all the Democrats or Republicans that you want. But here at home, we should be voting for Californians. And I think that's another
right. Thing. Well, that's kind of shots fired, Michael, because, one way to get out of the red and blue dynamic might be to say vote green. And so I want to give Dan an opportunity to respond to this idea, put forward, is the Green Party unable to reach voters because of its brand, quote unquote, brand problem, even if there's ideological alignment? Because that's a critique that I've heard of other independent party efforts like MPP.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't speak for all Greens, but I don't think we'd have a problem arguing to anyone that their grandmother shouldn't die. I think most Greens would agree with that. So I think we could reach anybody with that argument in addition to, universal health care. Pretty much, we obviously as a Green Party would want the best firefighting efforts. So I don't really think it's this cutting edge idea that you can, that's for Californians. I agree there might be some Republicans who are never going to vote Green or never going to vote Democratic and vice versa. But and I don't understand, is the California National Party, is that a secessionist party?
I mean, our ultimate goal is independence for California, but our general premise is policies that are best for California. That's okay. Well, I'm
against the secession movement of California. And just take one example. I know it's sort of off topic, but you're talking about the environment. So California can have these great environmental policies, which we could do anyway as a state. And then all of a sudden you have the rest of the United States, which is more likely going to head the right direction, because now you don't have the biggest number of electoral college votes in California. And all of a sudden the rest of the United States, which can cause a lot more pollution, is now going to be more environmental unfriendly. So I don't really, that's just one example of many.
Well, Michael, what do you say to that? What is the CNP's response to that critique, that you're ultimately sentencing the rest of America to become a right-wing country that's going to cause more damage?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of kind of California messianism, that sort of the United States will utterly fall apart without California and our amazing 2 senators making up, 1/50 of the Senate, because that's the thing. I don't understand how you're going to do it when 22 U.S. states have 40 million people and thus have 44 senators, and California with its 40 million people only have 2.
Well, sure, Michael, but we're also in a place, California also has 30 million voters, and we're also in a place right now where we're holding on to the Senate by the skin of our teeth, by a VP tie-splitting vote. And we're part of the stakes of this, which we haven't really gotten to, right, is that there's this risk that a Republican governor, God forbid anything happened to Dianne Feinstein, could be responsible for replacing her. So how do you manage the real kind of threat to kind of national democratic or progressive outcomes that your kind of party's agenda poses?
I think what needs to happen then is the National Democratic Party needs to start reaching out again to that core in the Midwest that used to be the entire bulwark of democratic success nationally in the United States. They've become too dependent on winning these guaranteed sort of coastal states. And what's happened is you wind up with an electoral college where, honestly, we're in California. We can vote for a cardboard box with a D on it as long as the DNC gives it a nomination, because we know those soon-to-be 54 electoral votes are going to go to whatever Democrat is nominated. At this point in the United States, in terms of the presidency, it's really down to about 100,000 swing voters in 6 states, none of which are California. So, I mean, California as the kind of guaranteed left Democratic vote, I think what that really means is what Democrats need to do is they need to craft a message that actually appeals to the rest of the United States and not attempt to rely on these sort of coastal votes that they've come to take for granted.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that there should be outreach to voters that have been largely ignored by both parties, but I don't know that I agree that should be a kind of rationale for why it's okay for California to secede. David, I want to get you in here.
I want to say, I think the heart of the matter is a class issue, the working class versus the capitalists. And that's something that's not spoken of by the other candidates on this panel. And, the theory of a California National Party is that somehow we in California share common interests, whether we're Mark Zuckerberg or an immigrant retail worker. And we don't. And when we look nationwide, I have no interest in defending the Democrats' majority in the House or the Senate. I have no interest in defending the Democratic Party, which consistently over the years has been pro-war, has been anti-worker, has overseen the largest transfer of wealth in history from the poor to the rich in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis and aftermath of the pandemic. So the issue here isn't maneuvering a third party to somehow get the Democrats to get the right messaging or to make the right electoral maneuver so that a Republican loses here or there. The question is mobilizing the working class on a politically independent basis. And to give a very concrete example, in March 2020, when we began having these lockdowns across the country, they were mostly driven by wildcat strikes of workers. I was a teacher in Oakland. I remember very distinctly Thursday night, March 12th, all the teachers started organizing a wildcat strike saying if schools don't close on Friday, we're closing them on Monday. We drew up our demands, and the very next day, the districts held emergency meetings and decided we're going to close the schools. Now, the union has worked very hard to suppress that militant class struggle. They fought very hard to claim we've got no option, we have to go back in, just like the United Federation of Teachers is doing in New York. And so then the question is, we shouldn't focus on the electoral map. We should focus on the map of the class struggle. The past year has seen some of the largest, most militant strikes in the past decade. We had a very recent, very large strike among Volvo workers that erupted in direct opposition to the union bureaucracy that was trying to keep them on the job. The crisis that's unfolding right now in schools, as Randy Weingarten, head of the AFT, is flying around telling everyone, you got to get back in the classroom, is leading to, in its objective logic, statewide strikes, the likes of which we saw in West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma. So my campaign, the pitch of the entire Socialist Equality Party, isn't this or that backroom maneuver or deal or ratio in the Senate. It is the education, organization, and mobilization of the working class to enforce the measures that neither the Democrats nor Republicans want because they are capitalist. And yeah.
I think there's something really appealing about that. And so I ask you this not as a gotcha, because this is the kind of thing that people ask me. I'm asking you this because I want you to have an opportunity to explain. The critique that I get when I speak in those terms, or I have guests on that speak in those terms, is often, okay, well, what's your theory of gaining power? What's your theory of change? And obviously, you see electoralism, at least symbolically, as some part of that, given that you're running in this recall election. But more broadly than that, what role do individuals listening, what role can they play in helping to support or participate in or galvanize the kind of movement action that you're describing? And what do you see as the kind of pathway to getting to a point where it's not, where the outside strategy works, where the inside is actually fundamentally changed?
That's a very good question. And so there's a couple aspects to this. What we're calling on people to do. I mean, obviously, I'd love it if they vote for me. I think a strong vote for a candidate this strong on eliminating the pandemic will send a sharp message to whoever wins the recall election. But we're also fundamentally forming rank and file safety committees in schools and workplaces. As we speak, the Socialist Equality Party is working with Dana auto parts workers who've been working. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's going back 200 years in terms of work conditions, 84-hour weeks for 6 weeks at a time before they get a single day off. Now, and so we're working with all these workers to build that kind of independent power to carry out the necessary strikes. But to give one anecdote from my own experience in the lead up to the Oakland strike, I was raising this with teachers, the need for a nationwide strike, which was a very popular demand when I was talking to teachers on strike in Arizona, when I was talking to teachers in Oakland. A couple of my coworkers said, because this was the Trump administration, remember, do you think if we had a nationwide strike, the Trump administration would actually listen to us and improve schools? And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm arguing against. What I responded was, and they thought this was mind-blowing, was if we had a nationwide strike of teachers, we could force Trump to resign. But the problem is Randy Weingarten, the unions, deeply opposed to any nationwide political struggle against the Trump administration. They wanted everything to flow through the Democratic Party. They wanted everything to, flow through Biden. And we now see the result, which is disastrous for schools.
I don't think Trump would have resigned no matter what on earth happened. I don't think he would have resigned.
We could have forced him. He would not have had a choice.
Well, let's frame it slightly differently. Even if it's perhaps a little hyperbolic to think, because Trump was a wild card, and Honey Badger does what he wants. You know what I mean? So but something short of that. I do think that your point, David, that represents an amount of pressure, kind of like extra political pressure, the likes of which no kind of like Women's March or Resist banner was ever going to create. And so I guess my question to you then, Dan, is, I am very famously a Green Party voter. It's me, Susan Sarandon, and I guess Nina Turner, who single-handedly made Trump become president of the United States of America. But the critique that the Green Party really does get is that because of either the fact that it's green and the logos mean it gets kind of shoehorned as this kind of environmental crunchy party with less of the ideological, like political ideology that Socialist Equality Party or the even Democratic Socialists have kind of baked into the cake. And so I wonder if you can comment on kind of how you see yourself carving out an ideological lane for listeners who are trying to decide what the best left candidate option is in this race.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's called the Green Party, so people automatically associate with environment. But if you look at the actual platform, I mean, it pretty much agrees with a lot of what David's saying. I mean, we're for obviously helping the working person. We're for universal health care. We're for universal income. I'm for a 4-day work week with paid vacation, paternity leave, maternity leave. I'm for all kinds of stuff, living wage. And I mean, it is in favor of economic justice and environmental justice. And as a criminal defense attorney, I'm a big proponent of criminal justice reform. They never had a lockdown at the courthouses. The whole pandemic, I've been going to court almost every day. And I don't think we need when the first pandemic first started happening, I was like, yeah, if we just all lock down so hardcore for like 2 weeks, they said it was like a 14-day thing, we could just end this thing. But in reality, first of all, you need a police state to really get the lockdown that David's talking about. And I don't
David,
know if
you're shaking your head. Why? What's your disagreement there? You think we can do it sans police? I mean, certainly these other countries we've been talking about didn't do this at gunpoint.
So I think people wildly underestimate the popularity among ordinary workers of actually eliminating the pandemic. And when we look at the mask mandates, the curfews, the closing of the beaches that I know came up as a complaint, this wasn't enforced by police going door to door forcing masks on people. Ordinary workers just started wearing them. And it's only kind of after the CDC, Biden, and Newsom lied to them and said it's safe to take them off that we started getting this massive resurgence. And so you don't need 100% compliance on every health safety measure. If you actually just have 3 safety measures with 60% effectiveness, you've already eliminated over 90% of transmission. And if you stack on a few more, so you don't need 100% lockdown. You don't need 100% ban on all gatherings. You need to tell people that that's what's necessary to eliminate the pandemic. You need to educate them and bring them on board. But, any thought that this would be done at gunpoint through a police state vastly underestimates the intelligence and the thoughtfulness of ordinary workers who are horrified at the number of people dying in this pandemic. I talked to one retail worker who said, I want Newsom out because everyone at my workplace got COVID. We were not protected. And I had to explain, look, why we're voting no on the recall, even though he has a very legitimate grievance.
Dan?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously people can voluntarily lock down and do all that stuff. And you can say, so you're saying we should say it's 100% lockdown, so hopefully 60% do it. And even then, like you said, everyone can, we have open borders in California to other states, at least for now. And even like Hawaii, they didn't have it for a while. Then all of a sudden they got it. And all these, like New Zealand, so it seems like even once you open the lockdown, because you don't want it forever, you're saying 2 months, it's just going to come back. It seems like, I mean, it might slow it down a little bit. Everyone's talking about flattening the curve. I mean, that seemed like not to do anything. I just
Dan,
don't think...
you sound a little nihilistic here. I mean, it feels a little like, I mean, like I appreciate you being like kind of realistic about the extent that even the best laid plans might not work because we're just dealing with something that's huge and largely unprecedented on this scale. Well, but also, you know, that I don't want that to be a stand-in for inaction or for people not offering critiques of failures that didn't have to be failures.
Well, I think what we need to do is face the facts that COVID is here. Maybe it's not as intense as everyone's. Yeah, and obviously people are dying. That's horrible. But what we need to do is spend money on how to treat COVID or how to, you know, vaccines obviously are good. They need to be better. Now they're saying you can still get it with the vaccine. You got to get booster shots. Some vaccines don't apply to the Delta variant. I mean, that's what we should be doing like a World War II effort on curing it or treating it. And so people don't die from it. It sounds like, and preventing it, of course. But I don't see these huge lockdowns. A lot of people want to go to work. A lot of people don't want to be. Not everyone lives in mansions, as you're saying, like Newsom in his mansion. Some people don't want to be crammed in a small apartment all day long and be forced to lock down. I mean, I like going to work every day. I mean, I took, I tried to stay distant and, do all the wear a mask, do all the precautions I can, but I don't want the government sort of telling me I got to be locked in my house and I can't go out at night and things like that. They're arresting protesters for breaking curfew. That there is some stuff done at gunpoint. I've defended some people who've been arrested at gunpoint for breaking the curfew. So it's not unheard of that you could get a police state in this situation.
Well, I do want to ask you, since we're kind of on the subject, about criminal justice issues. First, the extent to which you think they're at all relevant in the energy around the recall effort. And two, what your stance is on some of these hot button issues like defund. I'll start with you, Dan.
Well, yes, I'm in favor. I mean, I know defund is sort of it's gotten a lot of bad press. It's maybe not the best word to use, but I think even police will agree that they shouldn't be the ones dealing with a lot of issues like mental health situations, drug situations. And I think even logical police would say, yeah, we should take some of that funding instead of militarizing the police, which we have like in Los Angeles, and using it to hire people to deal with de-escalating mental health issues. And a lot of a huge percentage of the criminal justice system is full of people either with drug issues, drug addiction issues, or mental health issues. The Twin Towers in Los Angeles, the jail, is the largest mental health facility in the world, I think. And it's just these people charged with crimes and, they're not really culpable. They're mentally ill. And so we need to divert funds or add more funds to these kind of projects. We also need to end mass incarceration. That also millions and millions of dollars are spent because we're keeping people in prison for decades and decades based on these enhancements. Some are race-based, like gang enhancements. Some are they're back from the 80s and 90s when there was this whole tough on crime movement.
Right. Well, I want to ask you about that because California is a fascinating state to me. I mean, you guys will elect a Republican governor. At the same time, you vote for Bernie. And yeah, you give us these figures like Kamala Harris, who was famously a prosecutor who attempted to kind of rehabilitate her image as a progressive prosecutor, but in fact, came into public office by beating a genuinely progressive prosecutor in San Francisco, and who has tried to whitewash some like pretty horrific statements about, mocking the idea of more schools and not jails are what we need. And her famous truancy campaign where she threatened the parents of truant kids with incarceration, very happy to use the bully pulpit as California's top cop, her own self-description, to, launch herself professionally. Is this an issue? Are criminal justice issues really relevant in this recall space? Is that something that Gavin Newsom has come under scrutiny for? And I'm going to give you an opportunity to get in here too, Michael.
Well, yeah, I've done debates with Republican candidates, and they're all saying Newsom's letting everyone out of prison, which isn't even true. And they're saying crime's soared because all these new policies, which wouldn't even have happened yet anyway. So it's totally illogical. And now in Los Angeles, there is a progressive district attorney, and they're trying to recall him. It's part of the same movement that the right wing can't accept the election. So now they're just trying to recall everyone who they don't agree with. And so I don't think it's the issue that everyone's talking about, as gathering signatures for this race. Homelessness seems to be like the number one issue. And then, COVID, obviously. But yeah, it's not everyone's issue, but I think it is an important issue. And in terms of even just like defund the police or funding other things, we spend so much just on prisons and just these outlandish sentences. And Newsom, he's, like Sirhan just got recommended for parole. Newsom's not going to let him out. He didn't let Leslie Van Houten out, even though she's been recommended for parole 4 times, because it's not popular. He's just, trying to do what he thinks will get him elected next time. He probably had presidential ambitions. Those might be not as realistic with this recall. But, if I'm governor, I'll do the right thing. I'm not trying to be president of the United States. I just want to do what I believe is the right thing. And I'm not going to do it just because what I think is popular or not popular. So yeah, it's not the number one issue, but I think it's a very important issue considering how the United States has more people, both percentage wise and just number wise. We have more people in prison than China. They have 1 billion people. So I mean, it is a huge issue.
I'm just curious, this isn't, that related to the Newsom election, but I am curious what you make of a political figure like Kamala Harris. The newest approval ratings are out. Joe Biden's are low. It seems it was influenced by the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the media cycle, which is beating the war drum strongly in this case against him. And Kamala Harris's approval ratings are even lower, historically so for a vice president. What do you make of her presidential ambitions, and what do you make of how Californians on the ground perceive her?
Well, I wasn't in favor of her because of her record as a prosecutor and attorney general, was not progressive at all. And I think part of her unpopularity, I don't know, it has a lot of causes probably. She was tasked.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, when she tasked with I forgot, like
the border stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like, she was sort of in a no-win situation. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of hers.
Well, I'm curious, actually, in the course of you talking to voters, do you have any impressions for people who aren't in California about how she is received in the state? And if the answer is no worries.
It seems like every voter I talk to is either sort of a gung-ho Democrat or a gung-ho Republican. So they either hated them or loved them. So that's just the gist I got pretty much.
Well, I mean, I can speak to this perhaps a bit more because having lived in San Francisco for the last 2 decades, I mean, Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris came out of the same Willie Brown machine. They were both the anointed, and I don't think you can get a more structural Democratic power candidate in California than Willie Brown. I mean, Willie Brown to this day exudes great influence over the California Democratic Party. And Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris in 2003, as you mentioned, Kamala Harris went up against Terrence Hallinan, and Gavin Newsom went up against Matt Gonzalez, who's now the public defender here in San Francisco. And they were both just absolutely constructed, anointed Democratic Party machine candidates. They were selected because Willie Brown was being term limited out, and he wanted to retain control within San Francisco, and that was what Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris were there for. And it was interesting because in some ways you saw, and I'll get to Kamala as well, but you saw with Gavin Newsom the same thing you're seeing now, was that he got into a runoff with Matt Gonzalez, who was the Green Party candidate, and every other candidate endorsed Matt Gonzalez over Gavin Newsom. And Gavin Newsom had to bring in the Clintons. He had to bring in John Kerry. He had to bring in a bunch of non-California, kind of what he's doing with Bernie and Elizabeth Warren now, because he can't defend himself in terms of actually, I can do this for San Francisco or I can do this for California. He has to tie himself to the party apparatus. And to a certain extent, Kamala Harris has been similar to that. So, I mean, definitely here in San Francisco, the standing joke was if you become a victim of a crime and you want it prosecuted, make damn sure you've got like a guaranteed in the bag case, because otherwise Kamala Harris won't touch it. Because she wanted a very high conviction rate so that she could run for attorney general, so that she could get a high conviction rate as attorney general and run for senator and eventually for president, and so on and so forth. And I think that breaks down to one of my fundamental issues here, is that the Democratic Party infrastructure here doesn't actually care about California. It cares about advancing the power of the Democratic Party and advancing their personal careers. And Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom are just sort of poster children for these sort of constructed Democratic candidates, you know, who have a good look and who can wage certain types. You know, I mean, the epitome of it for Newsom was the declaration of marriage licenses in California that had absolutely no legal standing or validity, but it would make a name for himself, and he would be on the quote-unquote right side of history when he wanted to advance his political career. And I think for me, both of them are sort of emblematic. And again, you've got Garcetti, you've got Becerra, you've got all these people who are going to Washington, D.C. or going to get ambassadorships as if the problems of California were fixed, as if somehow they've done such a great job here, they're ready to go off and save the United States. Whereas, like, I don't see that Garcetti and Newsom and Kamala Harris have actually done all that much beneficial for California. They've done well for their careers and for Democratic Party power.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so on the ground, I think, kind of going to what Dan said, yeah, you have people who are Democratic Party loyalists, and Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom are the Democrats, and therefore they're my team and I support them, or they're on the opposite team and so I oppose them. But I think it's actually very hard to find people who will talk about Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris qua Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris. They will talk about them as stand-ins for the struggles of the Democratic Party, and especially the Democratic Party nationally. The Democratic Party has a 3/4 supermajority in both houses of the California legislature and every executive office. They're not the underdogs here in California, but they're very good at selling themselves this sort of underdog message vis-a-vis the struggles of the United States. And I think that is to the detriment of everyday Californians personally.
Well, is there not a part of you? I mean, I know the first question to all of you was, would you vote no on the recall? And you all said, yes, you'd vote no on the recall and would recommend people do the same. But is there not a part of you, and this isn't bait, but is there not some part of you that thinks, you know, let the chips fall where they may, because this is at least some moment of the well-placed frustration with the Democratic Party machine finding some voice, finding some airtime, and the people of California making it so that there are some consequences for Democrats where they normally can't because of the huge Democratic Party majorities in the state. You know, and that some people I think some people really are weighing the pros and cons of, yes, a Larry Elder can do some serious damage. It's also 1 year and that damage is limited. And some folks are quite obviously willing to take that gamble. I mean, David, what do you say to that?
I say anyone who takes their political responsibilities seriously won't bring down a government until the correlation of forces is such that they can replace it. And as I've spoken quite harshly against Gavin Newsom, and if anyone listening to this wants me to be governor, I would say join the Socialist Equality Party, form rank and file committees, and get me in there next year. Because the danger is if you just pull the pin on the grenade and toss it in. I mean, and I think I want to take up this point kind of sharply because it's very interesting. The Democratic Socialists of America have been essentially silent on this recall primarily, except their Los Angeles branch has issued a statement saying vote no on the recall, and we have no recommendations for question 2. And they're very much abdicating responsibility for this. And what we've seen in country after country, you look at the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, you look at the rise of the National Front in France, you have the Democrats in this country who have been moving farther and farther to the right year after year, just like the Socialist Party in France, just like the SPD in Germany. And by refusing to present a socialist alternative, the DSA is essentially saying all opposition to Newsom has to flow through the far right. And that's why I'm running, to provide an outlet, to provide an organizing channel to turn that spontaneous hostility, that very justified anger over Newsom's handling of the pandemic, the wildfires, etc., into a conscious struggle for socialism. And I apologize, I just wanted to tack on one thing. I know before you said what I was talking about in terms of these outside strikes was as a form of pressure on the government, and I would very much disagree with that conception, because my goal isn't to hold enough strikes that Newsom and Biden and ultimately, or Trump, decide to do the right thing. My goal in these strikes and in organizing workers is to prepare to take power, is to throw them out, is to get rid of them. And so the goal here is not to beg the DNC, the DSA-LA statement is quite significant. They say the path to Medicare for all goes through California. Newsom has to get the waivers for it. And so the DSA-LA is saying our job is to beg Newsom, to beg Biden to let California get health care. That's a complete dead end, because the Democrats represent a class that is hostile to us.
So there's a lot there. I really did want to ask you all about this whole Medicare for all philosophy that quote unquote runs through California, because we had Michael Lighty very charitably came on the show last fall in the midst of all of the Force the Vote stuff and I asked him, what's the alternative? Michael Lighty was Bernie Sanders 2020 healthcare outreach coordinator. I forget the exact title. My apologies. And he was previously in a similar role at both DSA and NNU. And, I said, okay, give it to me straight. What's the plan? And the plan basically was Gavin Newsom, through a Gavin Newsom presidency and, a state by state kind of approach, which, while I would never stand in the way of or, create an obstacle to, is a very different thing from the strategy that Bernie was advancing just, months before that conversation began, and also seems to have a 20 or 30 year time horizon that a lot of people living today find to be really unconscionable, especially since they gave so much money and personal support to a campaign like Bernie Sanders with the hopes of having it more soon. So I want to know, what is your response to that? What do you think the likelihood of a kind of a Gavin Newsom backed Medicare for all approach is? What's the likelihood of success there?
I will always come back to this because I think it's always fundamental. The issue is class, and the issue is the international economy. So when we look at the major reforms that occurred within the United States, they're generally speaking coming out in the aftermath of World War II, when the U.S. was responsible for over half of the world's industrial production. Since then, the relative economic strength of the United States has been in sharp decline compared to the rise of China, compared to the rise of the rebuilding of Europe, the rebuilding of Japan. And this has put an enormous squeeze on the willingness of the capitalists in the United States to negotiate with the working class. And so we have seen decade after decade of stagnating wages, of cuts to social services, of attacks to public education. And the answer to this is through the class struggle. I mean, there really is no other way. There's no subtle tactic. There's no figure like Newsom we can pin our hopes onto, because the answer of the United States, the Democrats and Republicans both, to the decline of the USA economy worldwide is rampant militarism. We have a record high military budget that was pushed by the Democratic Party. Joe Biden asked for a record high military budget. The Democrats said, let's go higher. And there's serious talk in think tanks in the United States that the U.S. military has to be prepared for a two-front war against Russia and China, and has to be prepared to win through massive casualties against two nuclear-armed opponents. You can look at the various think tank reports around the U.S. military. They're very seriously contemplating this. And so then the question for us, I mean, obviously the question was Medicare for all, for healthcare. The only way to take back that share of the national wealth that has been seized from the working class is through an overturning of capitalism. We aren't looking for halfway reforms or measures. We're looking to bring the entire economy under the democratic control of the working class.
Look, I'm with you, David, but tell me, what does that look like? Paint a picture for us on what the 2, 4, 6, 10-year horizon of that of that is, because I am not opposed. I am not opposed, but to the average ear, I think that there is a kind of incrementalism that emerges, not because of a lack of kind of ideological support, but because the public imagination has only been stretched so far. And part of that is because there are institutional members of the left who I think limit that imagination, who are largely silent on any kind of unsanctioned activism, including this general strike on October 15th that I haven't barely heard a peep about, and which basically kind of really argue that the diagnosis, which is a low labor density, is prescriptive in limiting what we can actually do or work toward in this moment. So can you, for those who are skeptical that anything they could do today would meaningfully contribute to an overthrow of capitalism as opposed to a more manageable goal, like, forcing Democrats to actually give us a $15 minimum wage, let's say, why should they be pushing for the former rather than the latter, especially since I think there is a perception that pushing for the former might jeopardize the chances at the latter?
Right. Well, I mean, if we go back to the classic revolutionaries and we talk about Lenin and the Russian Revolution, Plekhanov was a Menshevik who criticized Lenin and the Bolsheviks, saying, "You're going to offend the bourgeoisie with your extreme demands." And Lenin said, "The bourgeoisie, the capitalists, will forgive any number of indiscretions on our part. What they won't forgive is taking their factories." And that's the situation we're finding ourselves in. Our goal shouldn't be to not offend Newsom, to not offend Biden, to work out some compromise where we carefully balance Jeff Bezos' desire to fly into space with an Amazon worker's desire not to get COVID. We have to plant our flag squarely on one side. Now, you ask me, what does that look like?
Yeah.
I would direct people to look at our coverage of the Volvo strike, to look at our current coverage of the Dana brake workers contract negotiations. Over the recent few years, there have been these massive struggles of the working class. Matamoros, 70,000 auto workers in the maquiladoras right along the border went on strike, and it was blacked out in the media. Just like the Volvo strike recently was blacked out by essentially everyone but the World Socialist website that I write for. And, we need to build those into and build from them, not just a struggle over particular contract negotiations, but a political understanding that the reason wages and working conditions are so bad in every workplace, the reason why they're throwing schools open, is to get parents back in the workplace to make good on Elon Musk's $180 billion. We have to draw the sharp line and say, our task is to build those struggles, not to appeal to Clinton or Biden or whoever, because ultimately there is that fundamental class divide. And you see you mentioned the Affordable Care Act, this was an enormous handout of money to insurance companies, and ordinary people have not seen any benefit. We actually saw a significant increase in people who had insurance rationing their own care to avoid copays. And, one can go on, but the quote-unquote reforms that the Democratic Party considers acceptable and permissible are actually cost-cutting measures. The whole goal of the Affordable Care Act was to reduce healthcare costs in the United States. It wasn't to actually provide better care to people.
So I want to ask Dan and Michael, this class critique, I will say, as someone who does identify as a democratic socialist, is like, it's very satisfying to me to hear David talk in these terms. He talks about a socialist alternative. I recently joined Socialist Alternative a couple of months ago, in addition to maintaining my DSA membership, because I appreciated their kind of historical perspective and their willingness to be adversarial in a way that I don't believe that DSA always is. And I'm curious whether or not the Green Party or CMP has any kind of response to that kind of more kind of class-focused understanding of the power dynamics here that David just set out.
Okay, well, the Green Party does have an economic socialist sort of Green Deal, Bill of Rights type thing that Howie Hawks put forward. And I don't think we disagree, at least a lot of the party or me, with what David's saying. And get back on, you're talking about what about Newsom's Medicare for all? He could do it. He and the legislature, they have the votes. He doesn't want to do it for whatever reason. So
he has the votes for a state, California state Medicare for all.
He could. I mean, he could if he really pressed it. Seems like I heard like they pass it when there's a Republican governor because they know they won't get it signed, and then vice versa. So when they know it might get so for some reason they just don't want it to happen. So
for some reason,
yeah. So I don't see. And then in terms of, let's go back. You're talking about voting no.
Wait. So I want to stop there for a second. So to your point, Dan, is that while there is a class critique being made here and a power, you don't disagree with David's power critique, you would say that there is a lot to be done that could be done even by the current actors in charge if there were enough public pressure on them to do so. Well,
just in terms of, I mean, they could. Anyone could do it. I'm not saying they're going to do it.
So what do you say to that, David? Like, is it incompatible with your approach to say we should also be, let's say, getting behind a campaign to pressure Gavin Newsom to put Medicare for all to a vote in California, to say, okay, I'm going to vote no, but we'll get lefties to come out and vote no on the recall if Gavin Newsom promises to bring Medicare to force the vote on Medicare for all in California or whatever it is. Is that not a worthy goal?
Well, it comes down to what socialism is. And, just on a very basic thing, socialism is not a set of policy proposals. It is the working class having democratic control over the economy. There's no person you can elect who will then provide socialism to people. It's when actual workers take power. So the heart of it, the orientation is entirely wrong because, and Rosa Luxemburg actually writes very well on this in Reform or Revolution. She points out that the more reforms the working class wins through their struggles, the sharper the crisis of the capitalist economy is, because the more that's going to healthcare, that's going to wages, is cutting into the capitalist profits. And they're all competing internationally. So you have to view it as part of a globalized economy. Say California gets single-payer healthcare, and then all of a sudden, this would be such a miraculous chain of events, but it's hard to even describe it. But imagine Gavin Newsom actually did a good single-payer healthcare. Imagine that everyone voted for it and the billionaires didn't fight it tooth and nail at the ballot box. And then if he had actually worked and was sending a major chunk of the income of the California economy back to the working class, all the companies would get up and leave. And Elon Musk's $180 billion would disappear, and he would not take that sitting down. And so we have to be blunt. Who works for the working class? Who works for the capitalists? And there's not a middle ground.
So, David, I'm with you, and I might be a socialist, and you might be a socialist, but that when you framed it as the people, the party in charge is not going to give us socialism, I would agree, but I also think that a lot of voters, rightly or wrongly, aren't looking for socialism the way they are looking for Medicare for all, a number of other policy prescriptions. And while it might be an objective of ours to be fighting that bigger fight and explaining why more structural reforms have to be made, i.e. socialism, that to be kind of indifferent to the exigent needs of workers in this moment has the potential effect of losing the confidence of folks who might ultimately adhere to the bigger objective of socialism. So isn't the historical push and pull between reformism and hyper-leftism, as it were, trying to find that sweet spot where you do enough reforms and improve the lives of working people enough so that they have confidence to join with you for that bigger objective? And might one be losing sight of a potential reform opportunity that's very meaningful in a kind of a state Medicare for all achievement that we could be pressing for potentially right now, given the vulnerability of Gavin Newsom?
So there's a couple aspects to this. And I think most importantly, it would be fatal for any socialists to abstain from the struggles of the working class. but we always have to tell the workers the truth. And we can't lull them into a sense that Gavin Newsom is going to do anything progressive. And if the working class, to the extent any reform is even perhaps possible under capitalism, I mean, the economic basis is not there for it. And it would be used like the Affordable Care Act. It would be used like, well, to use an example from California, Jerry Brown raised a bunch of money for schools through a sales tax that they then shoveled into charter schools. The entire thrust of the Democratic and Republican Party across the nation is to reduce spending on social services and to increase bailouts of the banks and the drive to war internationally. So we can't go halfway on those particular points, but we are deeply involved in strikes and struggles, and it would be absolutely fatal to say that, oh, okay, no, we can't take part of this strike. But now you raise the question of pressuring Newsom in this particular spot because he's so vulnerable.
Sure. Actually, I'm low-key making this up on the fly, but sure. I liked the way it sounded.
I mean, you talk about history. There's actually an explicitly similar case in the 1930s with the Communist Party, 1931, I believe, in July. And so fascism is on the rise in Germany in 1931, and the Social Democrats are in charge of the Prussian state government. And the fascists call a referendum to bring down the Social Democratic government in the state, forcing new elections. Now, the Communist Party gave a set of demands to the Social Democrats saying, agree to this or we'll back the fascist referendum. It was a complete betrayal of the working class to do this because they joined in common cause with the far right to attack the Social Democrat. Now, obviously, the Democrats aren't Social Democrats, and obviously there are fascists involved in this recall, but they aren't a mass Nazi party. But the basic issue there is if you're orienting towards a deal at the top and you threaten, this democratic figure, this elected figure, saying, if you don't bend to our will, we'll back a far right move to take you out of office.
But that's not quite what I'm saying, David. And this is I'm not like advocating anything. I'm trying to get a sense of what a moment like this can bear. The question I'm raising, and this is similar to what I was saying in the course of the primary election, is if we believe, we spent the first 20 minutes or so of this conversation talking about all of the specific reasons why Californians, including liberals, are disgruntled with Gavin Newsom and this recall election even exists. And he is having trouble. It's like basically a 50-50 tie with respect to whether or not he's going to get recalled. I mean, people think it's not going to happen due to some polling and granular numbers, but it's very close, much closer than I would argue that it should be. The question is whether it would behoove him to advocate for enormously popular policies, whatever they may be. It doesn't have to be Medicare for all. I know that's my hobby horse, but whatever it is. And to be a different kind of person than the person that he has been and which got him into this mess to begin with, in order to turn out more voters, to get the support, the willing, enthusiastic support of all of the progressives in the state. The same was true of Joe Biden over a summer of unrest where it wasn't clear how that was going to shake out in the fall. And the same is going to be true for any number of moderate Democrats who face these kinds of pressures as more and more voters are disaffected as the American dream pans out for fewer and fewer of us.
So just briefly on that, because I think it actually demonstrates the heart of what I've been saying about the class issues, because Gavin Newsom has not responded to right-wing criticisms by moving to the left. He's responded to the threat of the recall by moving to the right, by pushing to reopen the economy faster, even when it's unsafe, by adapting to these very right-wing positions that, well, it's just time to infect everyone. And this isn't just Newsom. You see this as well very much on the nationwide scene. I mean, Clinton adapting to Trump and actually pushing the media to promote Trump because she thought he would be an easier opponent to run against in the 2016 elections. The response of the Democratic Party to the leftward movement of workers is not to move left with them. It's to move farther to the right. And this is how, I mean, you look at the current government, which, despite all the claims that, Biden is going to be transformative, where has he majorly reversed a policy of Trump. We see the continued attacks on immigrants. We see the continued disastrous and anti-scientific pandemic policy. We see new militarism and saber-rattling abroad. I mean, one can go on, but that's why I keep hammering on these class issues, that it's not an accident. It's not that Newsom's not understanding his own self-interest.
Right.
It's that he represents forces that are deeply hostile to us.
Yeah, so I guess to me what it comes down to is, I mean, you're not wrong, but there's two possible reasons for that in my mind. One is that your average Democrat would prefer to lose than to actually, it's more economically beneficial for the 1% as it were, for Democrats to lose than to actually concede to the left and embrace any number of social policies that manifest in a transfer of wealth from the top down, right? Or alternatively, there is not the left hasn't demonstrated an ability to deliver a guaranteed set of votes in the same way that some more affluent centrist communities have done. And so therefore their threat to withhold just isn't threatening. Right. It isn't credible. Right. Exactly. And if the first thing is the case, then there's nothing we can do. They're never going to listen. And the only option is what you're saying, which I think was what should be pursued regardless, in tandem. If the question is the second one, I think that there is some utility in figuring out ways to demonstrate that the left is a courtable kind of swing bolus of voters in the same way that any number independent voters and swing voters and other kinds of groups, entire purple states, have been able to draw the attention and focus of the Democratic Party. And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me to be an avenue worth exploring the same way that any other is, especially since I still have a hard time really processing the timeline of what you're describing for revolution and what it looks like, what the concrete steps look like to get there. I think that sometimes folks are like, oh, you're so obsessed with electoralism, and I don't think that's quite it. I think it's that there is a kind of unwillingness to talk in granular specific terms about what the way forward is in extra electoral context. And that leads people to just continue to gravitate to the thing that they know.
I mean, you keep asking this question of the concreteness, and I really would direct people to just follow the growing class struggle. I was there for the entire teacher strike in Arizona, where, there's all this talk about right-leaning Americans at times, and, the conservatives can bring out the vote here and there. I mean, there's a state that went for Trump, and I would be handing out leaflets and interviewing people who are lifelong Republicans or libertarians. And once we started talking about the need for a nationwide educators' strike, that's when they said, well, okay, I'm now interested in what you're talking about with regards to socialism. And when you look at what this practically looks like, you had, for example, this mass strike wave that went through state after state among educators. And in Arizona, like in West Virginia, like in Oklahoma, it was organized at the grassroots level. Teachers began talking to each other and called these strikes against the desire of the unions. The Arizona Educators Association, for example, was dead set opposed to this. But then what happened is they didn't have an independent leadership. They didn't have a clear political perspective. And the position pushed, for example, in Arizona was, okay, we call this major strike, and we're going to beg Governor Ducey, we're going to beg the Republican state legislature to finally fund public education. And when the legislature put its foot down and voted for a budget that gave into none of the demands of the teachers, the unions and some of these people who were organizing the Facebook groups collaborated to call off the strike without any vote of the membership, without any consultation. But if you're asking the practical thing, what happened if that strike had continued? And there's a direct impasse. There's tens of thousands of teachers with mass popular support across the state taking a firm stand, not just against Governor Ducey, but against the attacks from the federal level on education that can quickly spread out of control. Other states start going out on strike. You get to an intense political crisis. And the working class, the heart of it, what shifts it from being the retreat and a defeat that occurred in Arizona and the potential sparking of a real revolutionary situation is that political understanding of the needs to be intransigent against these hostile class forces. Because the thought that the state legislature or the governor were ever going to grant educators their deepest desire is mistaken, because the schools in Arizona, like the schools in California, like the schools in New York, are exactly how the government wants them. They want them underfunded. They want them understaffed. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of the practice. It involves a lot of on-the-ground organizing and talking to people. But through these very militant struggles, we're actually able to win people who had voted for Trump over to socialism. I mean, you, I'm sure, are familiar with states like Michigan that went for Sanders in the primary and went for Trump in the general election.
Right.
There is a large section of the working class that's looking for socialism, that's
West
looking
Virginia,
for a left-wing...
I had a question for David, because just going back a while what he was saying, but he was saying that, okay, so if the Democrat leaders started doing some kind of socialist stuff, then we're going to lose Elon Musk and the billions of dollars. Well, I mean, if David's elected and we get this socialist revolution, let's say that somehow happens, then they're really going to leave. So I don't know. I don't understand why you're worried about the capitalists leaving. Maybe I misunderstood what you're saying.
I think you did misunderstand. I want to take the wealth of the capitalists. I don't. A previous interviewer asked me, you can't please everyone all the time. I said, that's right. We are not going to please the billionaires. We are not going to please the capitalists. They're going to be deeply dissatisfied. You seem worried that the capitalists were going to leave California, but you're not. Newsom and the Democrats are deeply worried. Oh, okay. There's no way to maintain the economy under capitalism without the billionaires.
I want to ask you all, I know I've kept you here for an hour and a half almost. And I want to ask you, I think what perhaps might be an obvious question for many leftists listening, which is, even if the DSA kind of abdicated their arguable responsibility and other progressive groups haven't weighed in on who the progressive candidate for this race should be, why hasn't there been a conversation amongst you all about consolidating behind one left candidate, especially given what we just saw happen in the New York mayoral race?
Well, I wish they would, and I wish they'd get behind me, obviously, and everyone else wishes they get behind them. The Green Party has actually today, and Green Party of California endorsed me. Obviously, they don't speak for every left-leaning group. There's these other groups. And I mean, my argument is if everyone, even if maybe half of everyone or maybe less of the people who voted no on the recall got behind one progressive candidate, that candidate would win. That candidate would beat Larry Elder, because that would be about 25% of the vote probably. And Larry Elder is somewhere in the teens. So yeah, you're correct. I mean, they should. And I'm afraid people are thinking of getting behind Meet Kevin or whoever, he's sort of not even a liberal Democrat. I don't even know. I think he might be running as a Democrat. I'm not sure he's even a Democrat. He's supposed to be a pretty smart guy, but he's like a landlord. He's a YouTuber. I mean, he's not. I'm sure none of us agree.
Nothing wrong with YouTubers.
Nothing wrong with YouTubers, but and that's why he's the third probably most famous person. Not that he's that famous, but after Caitlyn Jenner and Larry Elder. So he is up in the polls higher than us at this point. And I'm afraid people are going to get behind him thinking he's the Democratic alternative. Obviously, we're not Democrats, none of us. I think if Newsom really wanted to help the Democratic Party, he would resign. The recall would still go on. The lieutenant governor would become governor. That'd probably take some of the wind out of the sails of the recall. And they'd stay in office. That's what he probably should do. He never will do, just like Trump would never resign no matter how many teachers went on strike. Newsom's never going to resign.
I thought correct me if I'm wrong, I thought the timing was too late for that. That he could have done that earlier in the race, but there's some question about whether that would be, constitutional or something at this point for him to resign.
Actually,
in the middle of the recall.
Yeah,
the recall would still go through. I mean, if they voted yes, it'd still go to whoever won the recall. But I think if he resigned right now, it would be the lieutenant governor. That's my understanding. Maybe Michael knows more than I do.
My understanding of it is actually if Gavin Newsom resigns, the recall's over because it's a recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. Once Gavin Newsom isn't governor anymore, there's no Governor Gavin Newsom to recall, and Kounalakis becomes a lieutenant governor with incumbency going into next year.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think it's what I'm saying. I think, maybe when they first started gathering signatures, he could have, before they got it on the ballot, he could have resigned, and then it wouldn't have happened. But I think once it's on the ballot, it's on the ballot.
I don't. But I think the legal paperwork is it's a recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. It doesn't just become a recall of Kounalakis if Kounalakis becomes governor.
Well, I'll try to get some clarity on that. And
it's not going to happen anyway. But
no, it's probably not going to happen. I mean,
but I think it is interesting.
If it were looking like the recall was a definite guarantee, I think the Democratic Party would pressure Newsom to resign, but I don't think he would.
So then this is the final question I'll put to you each. Why should our left audience choose you as their second ballot selection?
I'll start, I guess. Well, there's not too much differences maybe here. Maybe on some issues. I'm not for California seceding, so if you're not for that, vote for me over Michael. And I'm not for hardcore, 2-month lockdowns and things like that. I think I'm sort of I don't know, at least I agree. I'm the most rational. I have the ideas that are going to help California the most. And I just, on every issue, you can go to my website, look all kinds of issues. I address all of them. You can compare me to everyone else and be informed and make the best decision that you can.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, I know my sunglasses aren't as cool as Dan's from his fabulous boat, but I can dig it. I try my best. I'm kind of hip. But I guess I would say the reason you should vote for me is because, I should point out, I actually teach Marxist theory. There we go. There's the glasses. I actually teach Marxist theory at San Francisco State. I know my Marx and my Lenin and my Mao. I actually was a socialist 10 years ago. I no longer am.
Why is that?
I believe. Let me phrase it this way. The reason I teach Marxism is because I'm not a Marxist. For the same reason, I think evangelicals shouldn't necessarily teach the Bible, because I think anything useful that can be extracted from it probably should not be taught by a true believer, because that will tend to skew your ideology and your belief in the entire apparatus that is set up.
Should an evolutionary biologist, just to take this analogy to this logical conclusion, should an evolutionary biologist not believe in evolution?
No, but I think if an evolutionary biologist is teaching evolution, it might behoove you to find out what other people are saying about it and not just take what they have to say for granted because they obviously believe that.
Well, skepticism, I think everyone would appreciate is healthy, but I guess the question is, does being a skeptic preclude you from also being a supporter or identifying as a thing?
No, I certainly don't think that. But I definitely think it's obvious that a socialist is going to teach me socialism in all its grandeur in a specific way, just like an evangelical Christian is going to teach the Bible in a very specific way, rather than a holistic, critical way.
So you didn't have some come to Jesus moment, something that de-radicalized you, or something happened to you that made you question the efficacy or truthiness of socialism?
Well, let me put it this way. My general feeling about interacting with socialists is socialists believe that there are three types of people in the world. Socialists, people who are socialists that aren't aware that they're socialists yet, and the enemy. And I found it difficult to break the world into those camps. And again, that's why I feel like, I guess in response to your main question, I think you should vote for me if what primarily concerns you is the actual state of California, over which the voters of California have some modicum of control, unlike the international community, unlike the United States community, a place where Californians can actually address issues that are directly affecting Californians and not make them part of a grander narrative of class revolution or the dependency on maintaining certain political power party structures, but instead focusing on this thing called California. And I'm not telling if you don't believe if you don't agree with independence yet. I don't like the term secession. Secession is a word that people use. It's a loaded term. Nobody talks about the secession of nobody talks about the secession of Bangladesh. Nobody talks about if you frame something as an independence movement, you're giving it a pro spin. If you're framing it as secession, especially because in the United States that term is connected with the American Civil War, which is a completely unrelated issue, I feel like it's a very loaded term that I myself don't use. I think it's just independence. I think independence is an accurate term. Every nation has become independent from some other nation in the modern world. I don't think there's anything that's that strange about it. We are talking about a nation in the United States that became a nation because it got independence from another nation. I don't think there's anything that whack-ass about it. I think Gavin Newsom himself last year actually just spent, much of the summer talking about how California is a nation state. He did that because he wants to run for president in 2024 or 2028. But I mean, even Gavin Newsom is referring to California as a nation state. So I would say I'm not asking people to support independence by supporting Michael Loebs of the California National Party. I'm asking people to support California. I'm asking people to look at California as a real political entity with genuine political complexity, with genuine cultural complexity, with genuine economic complexity, and determine a way that we can come up with solutions that are not ideological, but endeavor to solve the actual problem of California. Because one of my main life lessons has always been, if the question doesn't make sense, then the answer won't either. And the real question here is about California, for me. The question is not about the Democrats or losing power in the United States. It's not about progressive ideology in the United States. It's not about global worker revolution. For me, it's about California, that this is a fundamentally California election. And I feel like a lot of these things distract from the actual problems of California and turn them into they ask the question wrong. So I would say,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I would just say, yeah, I mean, if you're asking why should you vote for me rather than Dan or David, I mean, yeah, if you're a hardcore socialist, vote for David. You're not going to like me, but if what you're primarily fundamentally interested in is California and coming up with pragmatic, workable solutions that can happen in the near term, I think that's what the California National Party has to offer, especially because democracy is about competition, and there is not genuine competition in California anymore. What you by and large have are a majority of places where 4 Democrats run against each other, from the moderate Democrats to the left-wing socialist Democrats, or 4 Republicans running against each other, but that's not genuine political competition.
Michael, if not a socialist, how do you identify? Do you identify as a capitalist?
No, I find by and large, I know we just got into the Billy Bragg "which side are you on" boy thing, but I can't think in that binary. I'm very unbinary. I don't think it's one side or the other. I think the idea of let me put it this way: I'm not a capitalist, and I am no longer a socialist. And I think I would allude to the final chapter of Frantz Fanon's "The Wretched of the Earth," that as long as we think the only answers are capitalism versus socialism because they were invented by European ideology, the rest of the world is going to suffer for it. We cannot sit here and just assume the only 2 choices are socialism or barbarism. That I think we need to have a more expansive view of possibilities. And so I would say that I definitely don't identify as a capitalist. I wouldn't identify as a socialist. I think that ideas from all of them can be put together in a workable, pragmatic solution. But I would define myself as essentially non-ideological, and I would define the party as the California National Party.
Thank you for that, Michael. Frantz Fanon, who is pro-socialist, but who objected to some Eurocentric ideas. Just to be clear, we'll have someone who's much more informed on that subject on soon to talk, I hope. David, you're the final word. I want you to address this idea that socialists split the world into socialist people who could be socialists and don't know it yet, and the enemy. And I ask you this as someone who both identifies as a socialist and also has come on the enemy end of the Socialist Equality Party in fairly recent history. What do you make of that criticism, and why should people vote for you as the left candidate in the race?
Well, if Mr. Loebs had studied as Marx, he would know that we actually divide the world between capitalists and workers. That fundamentally the distinction is between those who work for a living selling their labor power on the market and those who own things for a living. And it's a very sharp distinction. And so you can get things like Elon Musk, who earned $4 billion yesterday. I mean, and the thought that there's going to be some handshake, some compromise between these two is a little silly. But, I mean, what I hope your listeners take away from this meeting is that there is actually an enormous gulf between working class politics that's fighting for socialism and middle class radicalism or nationalism. I mean, I don't want to drag anyone, but I don't think anyone has presented very serious understanding of the pandemic or the overall situation confronting California. There's a perspective that the Socialist Equality Party fights for. And we are very sharp with our criticism, as you know, Briahna. We do not hold back.
I can take it.
The fundamental issue is, and it goes back to what I said, what socialism is. It's the working class taking democratic control of the economy. They have to understand what's going on. There has to be room for discussion and disagreement, even very sharp disagreement, because the stakes are very high. And so when we criticize Sanders, when we criticize Ocasio-Cortez, it is because they are orienting to and trying to get the working class and youth oriented to Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, or in the case of Sanders right now in California, Newsom. And so people should vote for me if they are for the working class. I completely disagree with the thought that there's some California national identity that's worth developing and improving. Nationalism is right-wing, full stop. And there is no progressive nationalism in an international economy. And the thought that all Californians have to come together across all classes is nonsense. We have to fight a very partisan fight. None of the problems confronting us can be solved on a local level. We are confronting the existential international crises of the pandemic, of global warming, of the threat of nuclear war. And anything that looks inward and is parochial, as it tries to replace an international viewpoint with the minutiae of local life, is backwards.
Well, thank you for that, David. And I appreciate your voice and the voice of the Socialist Equality Party out there. I think that I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It's going to take a lot of different people occupying a lot of different lanes. And someone like myself who has some reason to be allied with the bourgeoisie, given her own personal life circumstances, certainly merits a good pushing and prodding every now and again. And I appreciate all of you for coming on to the show and doing exactly that. This has been a really rich conversation, and thank you all. Very quickly, can you each just say website-wise, social media-wise, where folks can find you if they want to know more?
I'm at www.Kapelovitz, which is KAPELOVITZ.com. And then on Twitter is Kapelovitz, the number 4, Gov. And that'll get you far, I guess.
Great. Thank you. And Michael?
You can check out my personal campaign website at Loebs4, F-O-R, CA.com. Loebs, L-O-E-B-S, like the singer Lisa, but with an S at the end of it. Because that's the only Loeb anybody knows anymore. I don't even think anybody knows her anymore.
Leopold and Loeb, is that?
Yeah, that's a much better reference. That people dig. I was going to say the Loeb Classical Library, but unless you go to the really back room section of the library, you're not going to find that. You can also find out more about the California National Party at votecnp.org, and of course we have the standard social media presence that is required for the 21st century. So I'm sure you can find us out there.
Thank you, Michael. And David?
Yes, my campaign website is socialism2021.com. And then the Socialist Equality Party publishes the World Socialist website, wsws.org. I've written extensively on there. Most widely read socialist news site in the world. So I encourage everyone to check that out.
Well, thank you all. And to our audience, let us know what you think, please. And remember, always to keep the faith. Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.